There is a moment in every man's life when he finds out that the world he thought he understood is not the world that actually exists. Most men find this out slowly, piece by piece, year by year, in small disappointments that stack up like stones until the weight of them becomes impossible to carry. But Buck Harden found out all at once. On a single afternoon in the fall of 1876, in a two-room house at the edge of a dying Texas town, Buck Harden pulled back a loose board in a woman's kitchen floor and found something that changed everything. Not just for him, not just for her, but for every family in Sulphur Bend, Texas, and for a man so powerful and so corrupt that he had spent 15 years making sure that no one would ever find exactly what Buck Harden just found. I'm not going to make you wait. What Buck Harden found under that floorboard was not gold. It was not money. It was not a weapon. It was paper. A stack of documents wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a length of leather cord. Documents hidden for 11 years by a woman named Della Mae Pruitt. Documents that a man named Earl Doss had spent 11 years trying to locate and destroy. By the time Buck finished reading those pages, the trajectory of his life had changed direction so completely that he would spend the next 40 years trying to explain to people what it felt like to be an ordinary cowboy one morning and something else entirely by nightfall. Welcome to God of the West. Stay with me from beginning to end, because every piece of this matters, and the ending is not what you are expecting. Sulphur Bend was the kind of Texas town that existed in the space between what a place was supposed to become and what it actually became. It sat in the rolling limestone country of central Texas, roughly 60 miles east of the Edwards Plateau, and by 1876, it had a population of just under 400 people who mostly kept their heads down, tried to build something real, and did their best to stay on the right side of the forces that decided how things went in that county. Buck Harden arrived in Sulphur Bend in the spring of 1875, a year and a half before the events that define this story. He was 32 years old, which sounds young until you understand what a man who has spent 15 years working cattle in Texas looks like at 32, which is to say he looked closer to 45, with the hands of a man twice his age and the particular economy of movement that comes from spending most of your waking hours in conditions that the word difficult does not adequately describe. He hired on with a rancher named Cole Taggart, who ran a modest operation of about 800 head on land accumulated piece by piece over the previous decade. Taggart was a fair employer, not generous with money, but reliable about paying what he promised, which in 1875 Texas put him ahead of a substantial portion of his competition. It was through Taggart that Buck first heard the name Earl Doss. He heard it the way you first hear names that will later come to mean a great deal, as background noise, as the answer to a question Buck asked about who owned the land to the north. Taggart's answer was short and came with a particular tightening around his eyes that Buck noticed but did not pursue. He said, "Earl Doss owns it," and then he changed the subject. Buck let it go. New men in new places learn by listening before they learn by asking. He filed Taggart's reaction away and paid attention over the following weeks to what accumulated around that name in conversation. What people said, what they stopped saying, who stiffened when it came up. What accumulated was a pattern of small evasions and changed subjects and glances between people that told him Doss was a man of significant local power and that people in Sulphur Bend were careful around that power. The substance of it remained opaque for several months. Then he met Della Mae Pruitt, and things began to clarify. Della Mae Pruitt ran the boarding house on Calhoun Street, the only establishment of its kind in Sulphur Bend, and she had been running it for 7 years by the time Buck Harden came through her front door looking for a room. She was 38 years old, with the particular ageless quality of people whose faces have been fully inhabited, whose features carry the compressed record of what they have thought and felt and decided, and whose eyes are several decades older than their face in a way that is striking rather than sad. She was not a warm woman in the way that makes you feel immediately at ease. She was courteous and fair and absolutely precise about expectations, and she ran her establishment with a competence so complete and so unself-conscious that it took Buck several days to recognize it as the extraordinary thing it was. She had a daughter, 10 years old, named Willa, who had her mother's eyes and her mother's watchfulness, and who regarded Buck for the first 3 days with the focused suspicion of a child who has learned that new adults require thorough assessment before they can be trusted. He passed the assessment by answering 11 consecutive questions about horses seriously and completely, which was the right move, and after that Willa treated him with the particular warmth that children reserve for adults who take them seriously. Della May watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway and said nothing. But something in her posture changed. Some fraction of the guardedness she carried at all times eased very slightly. Buck noticed. He was a man who noticed things. He had spent 15 years reading terrain and animals and weather, and the habits of observation that work sustained in him did not switch off when he came indoors. He noticed that Della May was a woman who trusted no one easily. He noticed she was carrying something. Not a physical burden, but the other kind, the kind that changes your posture and your relationship to silence. He noticed that on 2 occasions during his stay, men came to the front door and knocked, and that on both occasions Della's face, before she composed herself to answer, contained something adjacent to fear. He noticed that after those visits, she checked the door locks before bed with a thoroughness that suggested habit rather than routine. He did not ask about any of this. He listened. He paid attention. He went back to the Taggart Ranch when the line shack was repaired and found, to his moderate surprise, that he thought about Della May Pruitt more than a man who spent 3 weeks in a boarding house would normally think about the woman who ran it. It was not only the ordinary attraction of a solitary man toward a woman who had been kind to him. It was the mental equivalent of a loose thread that your fingers keep returning to. He did not know what she was carrying, but he knew she was carrying something. And whatever it was, it had weight. Buck Hardin did not fully understand what Earl Doss was until the winter of 1875, when a homesteader named Roy Pettis sold his claim, 40 acres of decent grazing land, under circumstances that did not add up. Pettis was not a man who had failed. His cattle were healthy, his fencing maintained, his well clean. He sold in December, in a hurry, for 30 cents on the dollar what the land was worth. And he loaded his family into a wagon and was gone before most of Sulphur Bend knew he was leaving. Buck asked Taggart about it directly. Taggart sat with the question, looking at the middle distance in the way of a man deciding how much truth to deliver. And then he said, Doss wanted that land. When Doss wants land, he gets it. That was all. But the flat certainty of it, the absence of any suggestion that this outcome could have been otherwise, told Buck more than the words. He began paying deliberate attention to the structure of land ownership in the county. What he found was a pattern so clear that it was almost impossible to believe no one had done anything about it. Earl Doss had, over 15 years, acquired approximately 60% of the viable grazing land within 30 miles of Sulphur Bend. He had done it through a combination of legitimate purchase, strategic foreclosure, and methods that occupied the legal and moral territory between those two. Methods carefully constructed to resist scrutiny. He was not a violent man, by reputation. He did not need to be. People in Sulphur Bend did not cross Earl Doss not because they expected to be physically harmed, but because they had watched what happened to people who tried, and what happened was that those people lost. They lost their land, their credit, their contracts, their ability to conduct business in a county where Doss had relationships with every bank officer, every local judge, every official whose signature appeared on documents that mattered. Earl Doss was 51 years old, heavy-set and deliberate, with pale gray eyes that were attentive without being warm, and a manner in conversation calibrated to seem reasonable without ever quite committing to reasonableness. He had come to Central Texas in 1861 with capital enough to establish himself and the instincts to grow that into something larger. He had survived the war years, Reconstruction, drought, and market fluctuation through genuine business intelligence and a willingness to exploit every structural advantage available to a man with his resources. He was not a fool. He was not crude. He was the kind of dangerous that is the hardest to defend against, because it wears the clothes of respectability, speaks the language of legitimate commerce, and is always careful to ensure that what it does can be explained in terms that sound, at first hearing, like reasonable business. The circumstances that brought Buck Hardin back to Della May Pruitt's boarding house in October of 1876 were unremarkable on their face. A water dispute between Taggart and a neighboring rancher required Buck to spend a few days in town moving information between parties, and he took the room at the boarding house again without particular ceremony. Willa greeted him with the 11 questions about horses she had been accumulating for the intervening year. On the third evening of his stay, a pipe fitting under the kitchen sink let go without warning, and the water found its way through a gap in the floor into the crawl space below in a way that required immediate attention. Buck offered to help, and Della, not a woman who accepted help easily, considered him for a moment and accepted. They pulled back the section of flooring adjacent to the pipe fitting, and it was in the process of this work in the lamplight of the kitchen that Buck saw it. He was lifting a section of flooring board that appeared to be nailed down, and it came up more easily than expected, not because the nail had loosened, but because the board was not nailed down at all. It rested in the groove of the floor joists, held only by its own weight, and in the space beneath it, laid flat against the soil of the crawl space, wrapped in oilcloth tied with leather cord, was a package roughly the size of a Bible and considerably thinner. Buck stopped. He looked at it. He did not touch it. He looked up at Della May, who had gone completely still on the other side of the kitchen, still in the particular way of someone who has heard something that registers as danger in the oldest part of the nervous system before any sophisticated response can form. Her composure had not collapsed. It was too well established for that. But something underneath it had shifted, and what he could see through it was not fear exactly. It was the expression of someone who has been dreading a specific moment for a very long time and is now, finally, in it. He said, "Della." She said nothing. He said, "I have not touched it. I have not looked at it." He said, "You can put it back right now, and I will finish this pipe, and we will not speak of this again." He meant it. He was offering it genuinely. He had no claim on whatever she had hidden there and no right to it, and he knew both of those things clearly. The silence lasted long enough for Willa's movements in the back room to become audible. The small sounds of a child preparing for bed, the particular domestic music of an ordinary night that felt, in that kitchen, very far away from ordinary. Then Della May crossed the kitchen floor and reached into the crawl space and picked up the package herself. She held it for a moment without opening it. Then she looked at him and said, "There are things in this house that could get us both killed if the wrong people found out you had seen them." He looked at her steadily. He said, "Tell me." She said, "Why would I tell you?" He said, "Because you have been carrying this alone for a long time, and because I am not connected to anyone in this county who could use it against you, and because," he paused here, choosing words with care, "because I think you are running out of time." She ran her full attention on him with the instrument of a woman who has been lied to by enough people to have developed a finely calibrated way of detecting it. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, put the package between them, and began to talk. What Della May Pruitt told Buck Harden that night took the better part of 3 hours, and by the time she was finished the lamp had burned low and the pipe under the sink had been forgotten and neither of them had moved from the table. I want you to understand what she carried into that conversation. Della had come to Sulphur Bend in 1865 with her husband, Thomas Pruitt, a veteran and a carpenter, a careful man who had survived the war with his body intact, and his conviction about the future more or less intact as well, which was more than could be said for many men who came back from what Tom came back from. They had built the boarding house together, established themselves as respected members of the community, and begun to accumulate the small, stable life that Tom had always intended. In the summer of 1864, before the war's end, Tom had been doing carpentry work on the expansion of the county records office, working alone in the early morning before the office opened, when he heard a conversation through the thin partition wall. The conversation was between Earl Doss and the county clerk, a man named Garrett Fitch, and it concerned the alteration of land deed records for 17 separate parcels in the county. Parcels that had been legally homesteaded, legally filed, legally occupied by families who had built their lives on them, and that Doss and Fitch intended to refile in ways that would establish either a prior claim for Doss or a manufactured encumbrance that would allow foreclosure. The alterations they discussed were not crude forgeries. They were sophisticated manipulations of the county recording system. exploiting procedural ambiguities, inserting documents into filing sequences in ways that would appear to any subsequent examination to be legitimate prior filings rather than retroactive insertions. The conversation was specific. Names were named. Parcel numbers were cited. The financial arrangement between Doss and Fitch was outlined with a precision that made clear this was not planning something new, but detailing an operation already in practice. Tom had not moved, had not breathed more than necessary, had waited until both men left, and then sat with what he had heard for the remainder of that working day, and come home to Della that evening and told her everything, word for word. De la listen. Then she said, write it down. Write down everything, exactly as you heard it, with every name and every number. Tom did. Over the following 2 days, going back over the conversation in his memory, with the methodical patience of a carpenter to whom precision was a professional habit, he produced not a summary, but a record, a witness statement that would have been, in a court of law, the kind of testimony that changes outcomes. That document was the core of what was wrapped in oilcloth under Della, May Pruitt's kitchen floor. Tom had also, in the months following, documented additional evidence of the land fraud, additional instances where the pattern he had witnessed being planned was being executed. He gathered deed copies, filed correspondence, payment records, and a chain of transactions that, laid out in sequence, formed an argument that no reasonable person could have called anything other than systematic criminal fraud. He intended to take this evidence to federal authority. Not local, not county, but federal, because he understood clearly that local officials were either participants in or beneficiaries of what Doss had done. He had written to a federal land commissioner in Austin and received a letter indicating that an inquiry would be initiated. He was waiting for the follow-up when, in the spring of 1865, he fell from scaffolding while working on a second-floor structure at the edge of town and broke his neck and died before they could get him inside. The fall was ruled an accident. Della May was not certain it was an accident. She was not certain it wasn't. The uncertainty itself was one of the things she had been living with for 11 years. The question that could not be answered, the possibility she could not prove and could not dismiss. She had not gone to the federal authorities herself after Tom's death. The reason was Willa. Willa had been 2 years old when Tom died, and Della May had understood, with a clarity so cold and so complete that it still sat in her chest like a stone, that Earl Doss was a man who had demonstrated a willingness to remove obstacles to his objectives, and that a woman with a 2-year-old daughter who went to the government with a dead carpenter's witness statement was an obstacle. She could not accept the risk on her daughter's behalf, so she did what she could do. She kept the evidence, hidden, safe, intact, in the one location in Sulphur Bend where she had full control, where she could monitor every approach. She ran her boarding house and raised her daughter and watched Earl Doss continue his operations and said nothing, because saying something was a luxury she could not afford. She had decided, with the painful clarity of a woman who has thought something through to its full conclusion, that the right moment would come and that she would know it when it arrived. When she finished telling all of this, she looked at Buck across the table and said, "Now you know why I asked if you were sure about asking me to tell you." He said, "How many families did he take land from?" She said, "Tom's documents account for 17 parcels. There may be more." He said, "Are any of those families still in the county?" She said, "Some. Most left. A few stayed and rebuilt on what Doss left them." He sat with all of this for a long time. Outside, Sulphur Bend was quiet in the way small Texas towns are quiet late at night. Then Buck Hardin said something she had not expected, something that moved in her, a thing she had kept very carefully still for 11 years. He said, "You should not have had to carry this alone for this long." He did not say it to comfort her. He said it because it was true, and because he was a man who said true things rather than comfortable ones. She looked at him for a long time. Then she untied the leather cord around the oilcloth and spread Tom Pruitt's documents across the kitchen table. And together, in the last of the lamplight, they began to read. What Tom Pruitt had assembled was, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. Buck had enough experience with land management and cattle country commerce to read the chain of evidence and understand both its strength and its vulnerabilities. The witness statement was powerful, detailed, specific, written by a man with no motive to fabricate. But it was 11 years old, and its author was dead. The supporting documentation was stronger in some ways, because it was objective, but interpreting it required knowledge of local land recording practice that any federal examiner would need to acquire. There were gaps that a skilled defense attorney could exploit. Buck told Della all of this because she deserved an honest assessment rather than a comfortable one. Then he said, "What would you need to make it stronger?" She said, "A living witness to the altered records. Someone who worked in the county office during the period Tom identified." He said, "Is there anyone?" She said, "There was a deputy clerk named Hollis Wade who worked in that office from 1862 through 1868. He moved to San Antonio. I know this because I asked carefully through someone Doss does not know 3 years ago." She said, "I had the same thought you're having." Buck said, "You have been building toward this for 3 years." She said, with the flatness of someone who has been building toward something for much longer than 3 years. "I've been building toward this for 11 years. The difference is that 3 years ago, I understood what the final piece was. I just did not know how to reach it safely." He said, "Why not?" She said, "Because reaching out to Hollis Wade requires a communication that goes outside Sulphur Bend, and Doss has someone in the postal arrangement. I cannot send a letter from this county that I am confident he will not know about." Buck understood this immediately. He said, "I can carry the letter." She looked at him. He said, "I'm a working cowhand on a ranch with legitimate reasons to travel. I have no history in this county that Doss can flag. If I carry a letter to San Antonio, addressed to Wade, delivered by hand, that communication never passes through anything Doss can monitor." She said, "Why would you do this?" He said, "Because those 17 families deserve to have what was taken from them accounted for." She said, "Some of them have been gone for years. Some of them are dead." He said, "That is exactly what I said. There are debts in this world that don't expire because the people who are owed them are no longer around to collect." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "If you do this, if Wade agrees to speak and the federal authorities become involved, Doss will find out where it came from. He will know it was me." He said, "Yes." She said, "And Willa?" He did not look away. He said, "I understand what I'm asking." She said, "I do not think you do." She said, "I have lived in this town for 11 years with this knowledge. And the reason Willa is safe every morning is because Doss does not know what I know. The moment that changes, everything changes." He said, "Which is why we need to make sure that when the moment changes, we have everything in place before he finds out." He said, "There is a difference between this becoming visible before you are protected and this becoming visible after you are protected. The work of the next weeks is to be the second of those things and not the first." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "You make it sound straightforward." He said, "It is not straightforward, but it is the right direction." And then he said, "I'm going to need you to trust me." She said, with the particular dryness of a woman who has had very good reasons not to trust easily, "I do not trust people." He said, "I know." He said, "Trust me anyway." Willa's breathing was audible from the back room. The deep, even breathing of a child fully asleep, someone who does not know what her mother is carrying, what her father found, and what it cost him, what the next months are going to require. Della looked at the documents on the table. She said, "Tom spent 3 months putting those together." He said, "Tom did good work." She said, "He was a good man." He said, "I can see that in what he left." She did not respond to that, but something in her face, briefly controlled, moved in a way it had not moved during the entire conversation. Then she said, "When are you planning to leave for San Antonio?" He said, 3 days. She nodded. She said, "I will write the letter tonight." Buck rode south 4 days later with Della's letter in his coat and a summary he had written himself. A plain account of the evidence in Tom's documents, clear and free of legal language, designed to be understood quickly by a man who would need to decide rapidly whether to speak. He found Hollis Wade in San Antonio without significant difficulty. A former county clerk, now working as a bookkeeper, 52 years old, with careful eyes and the wariness of someone who has spent years being careful about what he says and to whom. Buck gave him the letter. Wade read it, standing in his narrow office, and his face showed the specific expression of a man being asked to walk back towards something he has spent years putting distance between himself, and underneath the fear was something that looked very much like relief. Like a man who has wanted to do a thing for a long time and has been waiting for the conditions to make it possible. Wade said, "Tom Pruitt is dead." Buck said, "Yes." Wade said, "I heard it was an accident." Buck said, "That is what was ruled." Wade said, "I worked in that office for 6 years." He said, "I saw things I did not speak about." He said, "I did not speak because I had a family and I knew what Earl Doss was, and I made a calculation I have not been entirely at peace with since." Buck said, "There is still time to make a different calculation." Wade looked at the letter for a long time. He said, "Della Mae Pruitt has been sitting on Tom's documents for 11 years. She stayed in Sulphur Bend all this time." Buck said, "Yes." Wade said, "That took something I'm not sure I would have had." He said, "Tell her I will speak." He said, "Tell her that Tom Pruitt deserved better than what happened to him, and that I have known it every day since." Buck rode back with Wade's agreement and a federal contact name in Austin. Hector Aldine, a land commissioner with 4 years in his position and a reputation, according to Wade, for the specific quality this situation required. He was not for sale. He arrived back in Sulphur Bend on a Thursday evening to find something had changed. He felt it before he could identify it. The particular texture of a town where something is differently wrong than it was when you left. He went to the boarding house and knocked. Willa answered the door, and the relief in her face when she saw him told him how the preceding 4 days had felt inside that house. Della was at the kitchen table with the alertness of someone who has been on watch. She said, "Doss knows something." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "He came here himself 2 days ago." She said, "He has never come here before." He said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said he had heard I might be thinking about leaving Sulphur Bend. He said it would be a shame, given how established we are. He said it as a courtesy call." He sat at that table. He drank a cup of coffee. He talked about the fall weather. Then he left. Buck sat down. He said, "He does not know specifically what you have. If he knew, he would not have come for a social call." She said, "He is telling me he is watching." He said, "Yes." He said, "Which means we are running shorter on time than I planned." He told her about Wade, about the federal contact in Austin, about the plan. When he finished, she said, "We need to get these documents out of this house. If Doss has this house searched, and if he is scared enough, he will. He needs to find nothing." Buck said, "The documents go to a man I trust in Corpus Christi, carried by me out of this county by a route that does not pass through any postal arrangement Doss can access." She said, "And then?" He said, "I write to Hector Aldine in Austin, directly, with Wade's name as a reference, with enough specific detail to make clear that what we have is serious and substantiated." He said, "And you and Willa come to the Taggart Ranch. Taggart has been told enough to understand why he should offer it, and he has offered it." She said, "Willa's school." He said, "Willa gets a few weeks without school. She will survive it. It is a temporary measure." She looked at him with the look of a woman who has been thinking about worst-case scenarios for 11 years and knows how to assess a plan against them. She said, "You have thought about this." He said, "I have thought about almost nothing else for 4 days." She was quiet. Then she said, "Tom would have liked you." He did not look away. He said, "I think I would have liked him too." They moved the documents the following morning. Buck carried them south by a route that swung wide of the main roads, reaching a relay post 20 miles from Sulphur Bend with no commercial connection to anyone in the county, and mailed the package from there to his contact in Corpus Christi. He wrote to Hector Aldine the same evening, 4 pages laying out the structure of the case with the clarity of a man who has thought carefully about how to make complicated things legible to someone encountering them for the first time. He gave Aldine Wade's name and location and specific knowledge. He gave him the outline of Tom Pruitt's witness statement and the character of the supporting documentation. He gave him the 17 parcel numbers and the names of the families. He did not give him Della Mae Pruitt's name. Not yet. He rode back to Sulphur Bend, collected Della and Willa and their necessary belongings, and brought them to the Taggart Ranch. Willa, told only that they were visiting for reasons that would be explained later, accepted this with the equanimity of a child who trusts her mother's judgment. She spent the first afternoon asking the ranch hands about horses. Earl Doss came to the boarding house on Calhoun Street 2 days after Della left it. He found it empty, locked, and unoccupied. Taggart heard from a man in town who had watched Doss arrive and stand on the front porch without moving for several minutes, which was unusual because Doss was not a man who stood still when there was something he could be doing. The stillness communicated something, that he was recalculating, determining what the empty house meant about how far behind he was. Hector Aldine's response came 3 weeks later, addressed to Buck's specified relay point. It was 2 pages, direct and careful. It told Buck that what he had described matched a pattern of land fraud the Federal Land Office had been attempting to build a case around for 2 years without the specific insider documentation that Tom Pruitt's witness statement would provide. It told him that Wade's testimony was significant and that the federal office wanted to move. It told him a federal marshal would be in Sulphur Bend within 30 days. And it told him that the safety of any witnesses and of any person holding documentary evidence was a federal concern that measures were being taken to address. Earl Doss was arrested on a Wednesday morning in December of 1876, 6 weeks after Buck Hardin pulled up a loose floorboard in a kitchen in Sulphur Bend. Federal marshals came from Austin with warrants covering Doss and 3 associates, including a current county official who had inherited Garrett Fitch's role in the arrangement after Fitch's death 2 years prior. The arrest was made at the Doss property north of town. Hollis Wade testified for 4 of them. Precise, thorough, steady under cross-examination that attempted without success to find inconsistencies in a recollection that had been sitting undisturbed in his memory for 14 years, because some things, once witnessed, do not fade. Tom Pruitt's documents were entered into evidence and authenticated by 2 independent examiners. The 17 affected families, or their surviving members, or in 3 cases their surviving children, were located and their testimony taken. Doss was convicted on 14 counts of land fraud and conspiracy and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Now here is where the story turns in the direction you did not expect. Because the legal question of what happens to fraudulently conveyed land that has passed through multiple hands in the years since its original theft, bought legitimately by people who did not know what they were buying, is not a simple question. It is one of the most complicated questions in federal land law. Some of the 17 parcels were recoverable, held by Doss directly or by entities sufficiently connected to the fraud that the court could order their return. Those parcels went back. The families or their heirs received them with the specific quality of feeling that belongs to something returned after you had fully accepted its loss. Not celebration exactly. Something more complicated than that. Something containing grief and relief and the awareness of what the years between cost. Other parcels, including 2 that Taggart had bought from Doss in 1869, were determined to have passed to good faith purchasers and could not be directly recovered without a separate proceeding the federal office did not pursue. Instead, a compensation fund was established from Doss's attachable assets, and the affected families received payment in proportion to the assessed value of what they had lost. It was not full restoration. It cannot be. 11 years of lost use and lost opportunity and lost futures is not compensable in any amount of money. But it was something. It was acknowledgement, the official statement that what was done was wrong, that it happened, that the record shows it. Buck Hardin stayed in Sulphur Bend after the trial. He had not planned to. He had spent 15 years not staying anywhere, had built his life around the habit of moving, and staying was not in the vocabulary of who he had been. But he stayed. He stayed because Taggart offered him a permanent position. He stayed because Sulphur Bend was a different place after the trial. Not transformed, not suddenly good in ways it had not been, but different in the specific way that a place changes when the thing holding it down is removed, when the accumulated pressure of a corrupt power is lifted and the community underneath has room, for the first time in years, to breathe. He stayed because Willa had 11 more questions about horses that needed answering. He stayed because of Della. Not immediately, not quickly. Della May was not a woman who moved toward anything quickly, and what she had been through in 11 years had not made her any more inclined towards speed in matters of trust. She went back to the boarding house on Calhoun Street in January of 1877 and reopened it and ran it the way she had always run it. She and Buck had dinner together twice in the spring of 1877 and 3 times in the summer. And by fall, the people of Sulphur Bend had stopped noticing it as unusual because it had become simply part of the texture of how things were. They married in the spring of 1878 in the Sulphur Bend church that doubled as a schoolroom, on a morning when the Texas Hill Country was doing the particular thing it does in spring when the rain has been good, turning green and improbably alive, as though the land itself is making a point about persistence. Hollis Wade came from San Antonio for the wedding. He and Della shook hands in the churchyard before the ceremony, and what passed between them in that handshake was the particular acknowledgement of 2 people connected by a dead man's honesty, a long silence, and the decision to finally break it. Nobody made a speech about Tom Pruitt that day. They did not need to. He was present in the fact of the day itself, in the documents that made the trial possible, in the justice the trial produced, in the land returned to families who had lost it, in the daughter who had grown up knowing nothing about any of it and was now 12 years old and asking the preacher's horse a series of focused questions about why it was tied to the post instead of free to move around. Della May kept Tom's original witness statement, not the copies submitted to the federal court, not the authenticated duplicates in the federal record. The original, in Tom's handwriting. She kept it in a box on the shelf above the fireplace. Not hidden, not under any floor. Just there, where it could be seen, where anyone who asked could be told what it was, what it had cost, and what it had eventually accomplished. She told Buck once, in the quiet of a Texas evening, when Willa was asleep and the house was still, that she had thought many times about what Tom would have made of how it ended. Buck said, "What do you think he would have made of it?" She said, "I think he would have said it was what was supposed to happen." He said, "Do you believe that?" She was quiet. Then she said, "I believe it happened. After 11 years of not knowing if it would, I believe it happened, and it mattered, and the families who got something back deserve to get it back. Whether it was supposed to happen is a question I'm going to leave to people with more certainty about the way the world works than I have managed to develop." He said, "That is a very precise answer." She said, "I am a precise woman." He said, "I know. I knew it from the first week." She said, "What else did you know from the first week?" He said, "That you were carrying something too heavy to carry alone." She said, "And you decided to help carry it." He said, "I decided I wanted to." He said, "There is a difference." She was quiet. Then she said, "Buck." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you for pulling up that floorboard." He thought about that. He said, "Thank you for having the sense to hide something under it in the first place." That was the last word on the subject between them, which was fitting. Della May had never been a woman for unnecessary words, and Buck Hardin had spent 15 years learning the value of saying exactly as much as needed to be said and no more. And between them, they had the particular economy of 2 people who understand each other well enough that most of what matters is communicated in the space between what is spoken. I told you at the beginning of this video that what Buck Hardin found under that floorboard was not gold, not money, not a weapon. I told you it was paper, and I told you that paper changed everything. I want to leave you with one thought about this story, about what it means and why I chose to tell it here, on a channel dedicated to the real stories of the frontier. Not the mythologized version, not the cleaned up version. The version that actually happened to actual people who got up every morning and faced the specific conditions of their specific lives without the luxury of knowing how things are going to turn out. Della May Pruitt spent 11 years doing the hardest thing there is to do. Not the dramatic kind of hard, not the visible kind that gets written into histories and celebrated in songs, but the quiet, daily, grinding kind of hard. The kind that looks from the outside like just living your life. She ran a boarding house. She raised her daughter. She made beds and served meals and locked the doors every night for 11 years, knowing what was under the floor, knowing that the wrong move could cost her everything, and choosing, day after day, to wait for the conditions that would let her act without getting her daughter killed. That is not passivity. That is not weakness. That is the kind of endurance and intelligence that history does not know how to celebrate, because it does not look like anything you can put on a monument. And Buck Hardin, An ordinary working cowboy with no particular stake in any of it, no history in that town, no personal connection to the injustice that had been done, made a choice. He made it in a kitchen, in lamplight, looking at a woman who needed someone to trust and who had every good reason not to trust anyone. He made it not because there was something in it for him, and not because someone told him it was the right thing. He made it because he could see clearly what was happening, and he was the kind of man who, when he can see clearly what is happening, does something about it. That combination, the woman who held on long enough and the man who showed up at the right moment, produced something real. 17 families got acknowledgement, so got their land back. The man who had stolen from them spent 12 years in federal prison. And a little girl named Willa grew up knowing what her father had done and what her mother had protected and what a quiet cowboy from outside the county had chosen to do on an October evening when he could easily have fixed the pipe and gone to bed. That is the West I want to talk about on this channel. Not myths, real people, real choices, real consequences. If this story hit you somewhere, if any part of it stayed with you, leave me a comment below. Tell me what moved you. Tell me what surprised you. Subscribe to God of the West if you have not already. Ring the notification bell. Share this video. These people existed. These choices were made. This justice, imperfect, delayed, incomplete in the way that all real justice is incomplete, happened. And it deserves to be remembered. God of the West, out.